Welcome to the Cafe Culture Podcast, a season of discussions on culture, politics, philosophy and science.
Thank you. Today I'm going to talk to you about my research that I did in a secondary school, so ethnographic research in a secondary school, and how I've used that to understand this question of negative body image or bodily dissatisfaction, or why so many girls are unhappy with their bodies. But just to start, if you just think for a moment about when recently you thought someone looks good. And I'm not going to suggest anything else, but think about what they were doing, think about what they looked like. What was that moment when you thought, oh, that person looks good? Just hold it in your minds and we'll come back to it at the end. So I'm a social anthropologist, and I'm going to talk a bit about what social anthropology is. And I did fieldwork, as I said, in a London secondary school. And what I observed from my fieldwork, and what I also know from teaching now probably hundreds of young women as a university lecturer, but also in a project which I do with girls in school, which I'll talk to you a bit about at the end as well. And also from my own experiences, so especially when I was younger, my friendships and my friends and that kind of bodily unhappiness that many girls have with their bodies, it's very pervasive and is a real deeply felt issue, painful thing for lots of people. And my argument today is not that that isn't the case, but that the way that it's commonly understood, the way that it's assumed to be why this is the case, why so many girls are unhappy with their bodies, is unsatisfactory, and actually does an injustice to girls' lives. And I think this relates to a larger point about the way we treat young people as somehow completely different from us. And this isn't just this generation, but it seems like every generation there's this idea that the next generation is having some completely different experience to the experience we have, and thinking about why that might be. So how is bodily unhappiness or negative body image commonly understood? What I'm going to talk about, this media cause and effect model, will probably be quite familiar to all of you. So it's common in research, but it's also part of a kind of common sense understanding of how things work. There's images all around the place of slender celebrities and film stars and models, and this kind of perfect body image that we're surrounded by in the media, and that's the mainstream media, but more recently in social media. And girls have a bad diet of these images. They kind of swallow them, and that causes their bodily unhappiness. And this is a pretty simple story. So in this position, we've got the kind of individual girl, and then we've got the media, and these images are kind of being poured into their heads. So there's a kind of one-way linear relationship between the individual girl and these media images. And so the majority of mainstream research starts with this assumption. And then if you start with this assumption, then how you conduct research after that is going to follow. So, for example, you get some girls and you put them in a room with some magazines and you ask them how they feel about their bodies before, and then you ask them how they feel about their bodies afterwards. And so, as I said, this model is so common as to be taken for granted and as kind of common sense. But if we go beyond common sense, if we think, okay, rather than just taking it as for granted, what is assumed by this model and what's left out of this model? So what's assumed by this model of media cause and effect? This model assumes that their sense of self, that girls' whole kind of sense of self, that a big part of their experience of their body is almost entirely structured by this bad diet of media images. So media images are assumed to be the most important thing. And feminist cultural theorists Abigail Bray and Claire Colebrook wrote that this kind of amounts to an ingestion model of subjective formation, the idea that our selves are just formed by this swallowing of images. And it's a very mind-dependent account as well. So it focuses on this, we see the representation, we ingest it with our eyes, and somehow this forms everything about us. This internalization of external images. And more so, these girls are presented as passive and uncritical, and as Elspeth Probem writes, pathologically susceptible to images. And the interesting thing is that some people are assumed to be kind of pathologically susceptible to images, and that's often teenage girls, but it's other groups in society too. So, for example, young black boys and the discourses around hip-hop or drill music and the relationship to knife crime, again, they get kind of positioned as pathologically susceptible to these media images, but other people, other groups don't get positioned in this way. The adults doing the assuming about this often aren't positioning themselves as pathologically susceptible. So what does it miss out? What does this media cause and effect model miss out? Well, if we're just focusing on the individual girl, what are we missing out? Lots of things. Their everyday lives, the relationships they're immersed in, all the things they do apart from consume media images. And also just the real kind of tangible experience of being in a body and the kind of non-representational nature of that. So if we want to think about questioning these assumptions and also thinking about what's missed out of these conventional accounts, what can we do about it? Well, we need to go beyond the laboratory and this kind of experimental mode of conducting research, and you'll be happy to know that has the answer, because of course the answer is anthropology and doing fieldwork, so doing ethnographic fieldwork. So some of you, I'm sure, know what social anthropology is, but it's a form of social research, and the kind of archetypal anthropologist was Brownlow Malinowski, going to the Trobriand Islands in 1918, actually getting stuck there because of the First World War. So he ended up staying there for about 2 years. He went to the Trobriand Islands and he said, you need to pitch your tent. So before this, anthropologists, if they even went there, they sat on the veranda and they looked at things from a distance, or they just looked at things from books. He said, to understand people, you need to go there, you need to learn the language, you need to live among them. And when you do that, you understand what's going on. And what seems initially very strange or exotic or frightening makes sense. And in fact, at the time, there was, of course, a very derogatory discourses about the natives and the savages, and he found that they had this amazingly complex system of the cooler exchange system, which was connecting all the islands together in this exchange system of bracelets one way and necklaces the other, and a hugely complex social system, which made sense in their terms. So it made sense from their perspective. It was completely logical from their perspective. Now anthropologists study all over the world, and of course they study places like Britain as well, like what I've done. But at the heart of it is the same research method, which is that if you really want to understand people's lives, you need to go and live among them and spend time with them and really understand the complexity of what goes on in people's everyday lives. And you could say that if Malinowski's work was about making the strange familiar, my work, which is going into school, going into a very kind of ordinary experience that people often take for granted, is about making the familiar strange. It's about pointing out that actually school is really weird. It's a very strange thing. We go into this place, and then we're kind of with people who are just in one age group, 1 year of each other, and we're all compressed and separated from the rest of society. And we take this for granted because, of course, that's just how it's done. But actually, when you think about it, it's quite an odd way to organize people. And so this has particular effects. What I noticed when I was at school, coming back after, which I'd lived the first time being at school, is that school is a very intense place for social relationships. There's a lot of investment and time that young people put into these relationships. And what it amounts to is a social system, a hierarchy, that they recognize, that everyone recognizes regardless of their position in the hierarchy. So one of the kind of common misconceptions of young people is that they're kind of obsessed with themselves, they're self-obsessed. But actually, they're really obsessed with each other. They're just not interested particularly normally in adults. So what I did was I spent time in school and I did what you would do in school. So I spent time with year 11 students, so 15 to 16-year-olds. And I went to lessons and I spent time with them at lunchtime and break time. So I spent time in their adult-free spaces. So there's a phrase which is deep hanging out. And I think that's what ethnographic fieldwork is, it's deep hanging out. And what I want to talk about in this paper is how this deep hanging out can then help us think about this big issue, this issue that affects a lot of people's lives in a different way. And that's what a lot of anthropology is. It's thinking about things in a different way, because as soon as you get involved in people's lives and you spend every day with them, then nothing is black and white anymore. It's always grey, lots and lots of grey areas. And what I want to argue is that looking good in school, what it means to look good in school, is shaped by these kind of global body and beauty ideals, but is also about local ideas of value and status. So it can't just be reduced to these body and beauty ideals. But just to help us understand this, I want to think a little bit about theory, theories of learning, and how, like the assumptions, again, of how we learn. So there's a conventional theory of learning which imagines it as decontextualized and an individualized internalization of external knowledge. So hopefully that will be something that now you recognize, because that's also the assumptions of the media cause and effect model. So the media and cause and effect model builds on a broader conventional understanding of how we learn. And this theory of learning has been challenged in a lot of different ways. One of the seminal texts on this is Situated Learning, which was published in 1991 by the anthropologist Jean Love and the educational theorist Etienne Wenger. And they argued instead that learning is a fundamentally social practice, and so it happens between people in communities of practice. And communities of practice are groups of people who are engaged in a common activity, a common form of learning or knowledge or participation. And so they can be formal, like, for example, school, but they can also be informal, so a hobby group or a group of people who come together to discuss a book or something like that. As they point out, if humans are very excellent at learning, and then, on the other hand, school is a very ineffective way of learning. And maybe that's because the human way of learning, which is about being involved in relationships and being brought into learning through more expert people, and being in this context of social learning, is not what the model of learning that's assumed to be the case in school. So people go into school and they're sat in classrooms, and they're somehow expected to internalize this external knowledge. So building on this critique of theories of learning, Tim Ingold, another anthropologist, proposes a perspective on learning not as a transmission of information, but rather an education of attention. So an engagement in the world, through which we develop skills of perception and cognition in particular material and social contexts. So we're always engaged in the world, and that helps us tune in to particular things, and through tuning in and developing our skills in that's how we learn. And so we can use the example of vision, because that's what we're going to be thinking about. When you think about what it means to look good, when you think about body image or body ideals, is connected to vision. And so from this perspective, vision isn't a faculty, as he writes, a faculty of pure, disinterested reflection, whose role is merely to deliver things up to a transcendental consciousness, but rather is a skilled sense through which we learn to see in particular ways. And it's also reciprocal and interpersonal. So again, he writes, your visibility, your identity, indeed your very existence as a person is confirmed in the sight of others. In normal circumstances, to see another person is to know you're being seen by them. So all the time, of course, I've got lots of people looking at me, and just one person, I'm just one person. And that's one of the funny things about teaching, is learning that when you're in a class, you can be seen. And that was one of the things that it took me to being a teacher to learn, is that the teacher is seeing you just in the same way as you're seeing them. But so it's that sense that when we're looking at someone, they're looking back at us. And we're going to think about this in terms of body image, because body image is commonly understood as this internal thing that people have. But actually, we can think about it a lot more about the look we have for others. When we think we're evaluating someone else, then we assume that they're evaluating us in the same way. So the anthropologist Christina Grassini terms this unskilled vision. So the way that some people develop, so we can develop we use our eyes skillfully, and we learn this. And again, this isn't just in terms of looking at human bodies. We can think about all the different ways you might have unskilled in vision. Maybe we'll talk about it afterwards. If you're a bird watcher, or if you're interested in art, if you can spot, oh, of course, that's that artist. Your vision is unskilled in a particular way in which other people's vision isn't. So it's a learned development of vision. And so I think unskilled vision is a really useful way to think about beauty as well, because the really interesting thing about beauty is that, on the one hand, as the ethnographic data shows, beauty and body ideals are really culturally variable. There's a real difference in what people consider to be beautiful. And on the other hand, beauty seems totally self-evident within particular contexts. And this kind of relates to this idea that there's this assumption that body and beauty ideals are somehow about the media and we need to kind of get rid of them. But that ignores the fact that throughout time and space, there has been body and beauty ideals. What they are is what changes. So, for example, the anthropologist Rebecca Popinot, she conducted ethnographic fieldwork among the Azwa Arabs in Niger, and they have a beauty ideal of extreme feminine fatness. And so she writes that, she as an anthropologist might explain it in terms of the social and cultural situation and the type of Islam that they practice and ideas about femininity and masculinity and all these things. But when she asked her participants, they just, of course, fatness is beautiful. Fatness just is beautiful. Just like we might say, of course that person is beautiful, or of course that person is beautiful. It seems completely self-evident. She writes, the aesthetic, like beauty aesthetics everywhere, seems so obvious and natural to its adherents that they have little incentive, indeed little cause to reflect upon it. So my contention is that this notion of unskilled vision can really help us to understand beauty is both cross-culturally variable and feeling completely self-evident within specific contexts, because our vision is being trained to see particular things as beautiful. And we're learning, and what I'm going to be talking about now is that how we learn to see particular kinds of bodies as beautiful, and how that might happen between peers in school, as well as in relation to media images. So I mentioned that status in school there's a hierarchy in school, there's a status that's recognized by the pupils, regardless of where they were in the status hierarchy. So whether they were high status or low status, they recognize this status hierarchy. And they describe this in terms of being seen and being known. So Leah, 15, says, they're the ones with presence, the ones who have attention on them. They're loud, people look at them. So being seen and known is associated with kind of fame and visibility. So Jerome, who was talking about his experiences of being popular, says it's like being a celebrity or something. You can be at the top of the mountain and everyone is just trying to get you off that mountain and climb up the mountain themselves. It puts you under a lot of pressure sometimes because you don't want to be popular, you don't want to be known, you just want to get on with your life. So status is this one-way, in school, status is this one-way system of visibility where people who are high status are visible, but people who are low status are expected to be invisible. So some of the high status pupils said, it sounds really bad, but some people I just didn't even know they existed. And this necessitates learning particular ways of seeing and being seen that are different for low status pupils and high status pupils. So there's a group of low status pupils and Leah is talking to her friend and she's giving him advice because he keeps getting a lot of grief from the high status boys. And she says, Dominic, you complain things are bad and they are bad, but you're making them worse. So telling Peter, this happened in dramas class, a high status boy, to come out of the closet, it's just drawing attention to yourself. People were laughing at you, not with you. So even though actually the idea of joking at someone's expense and making yourself visible in that way is a totally legitimate activity for the high status boys, for a low status boy to do it is illegitimate. He's making a show of himself. He's drawing attention to himself in the wrong way. So there's a tacit orchestration of the way status is being recognized and legitimized by peers, and that is to do with the right way to be seen and the right way to see someone. So we can consider seeing, so vision, as reciprocal with being seen, with visibility, and we can think about this as an education of attention within a particular community of practice, and this relates to local ideas of status and value, who in this local, very micro context is the high status one and who is the low status one. And peers are training each other to see in this way. And so this relates to local status, notions of status and value. But also, gender is a very big part of this. So the route to which status is achieved is really gendered. So for boys, it's about being good at sport, being kind of overtly dominating. It's about forms of action. And for girls, it's about looks. So Lexi, talking about the group of popular girls in her year, said, yeah, Natasha and that lot, they've been popular since year 11 because of their looks, basically. That instantly gives them status. So girls get associated with their looks, the look they have for others, much more than boys do. Boys are allowed for it to be about action. Another thing that's really pervasive in school, really common in school, is all the evaluations that go on. So when going back to school after some time, you feel like, wow, this is such a goldfish bowl of everyone is looking at what each other are doing and talking about what each other is doing. And this is part of a result of this kind of compression and intensification of peer relationships. Because if you're in the same place as these 200 people for 6 hours a day, for 5 days a week, you really are looking at what each other's doing in a way that maybe happens in some parts of adult life, but probably a lot less. You really know what's happening with everyone. And so it's about observing, monitoring, assessing, discussing what people are doing and what they're looking like. And for girls, a big part of this is the evaluations of each other's bodies and looks. So this is really a significant part of these more encompassing evaluation practices. So this is a conversation between some friends, 3 friends. And Lily says, Helen and Molly, I think they're a bit fat, but... And Elizabeth said, well, I'd say Natalie as well. Lily, I don't know. Ella, I think they're just plump. Molly's not that fat. Lily, no, because Natalie's just kind of broad. Elizabeth says, Scarlett is very curvy, but it's good curvy. She has the most amazing figure. Ella, it suits her. I mean, I couldn't imagine her to be like really skinny. Yeah, Lily, she's not like fat, she's curvy. And then Elizabeth, she's wide, but she's good wide. It's not bad wide. But I think she feels it's not. I don't think she likes it. She's not comfortable with it. So you can see that this kind of evaluations about bodies are, about the minutiae of different parts of the body, but also about kind of like these very subtle criteria about different kinds of bodies. And a lot of the girls' interactions is about bitching, so talking about people behind their back, talking negatively about people about their backs, but also compliments. And actually, this isn't something that just girls do, women do this a lot too. So when you compliment someone about their appearance, you're doing something nice, you're having a friendly, positive interaction, but you're also indicating, I've seen you, and I've noticed what you look like. So you're reminded that people are looking at you and they're thinking about what you look like. So so these kinds of forms of evaluation are also about structuring each other's perceptions about what is a good kind of body, what is the right kind of body, what is the wrong kind of body. And they relate to these broader ideas of body and beauty, these ideals, but they also relate to more because it crystallizes around what you look like, but it's also about whether you're acting right. So it's all tied, it gets tied in together. And you can see that girls are kind of training each other into what to look for and how to see. So Georgia's talking about when she started in year 7, so when she started school at age 11, and she's talking about the popular girls again. And she says, yeah, in year 11, we were all really youthful. And they did their hair, they did their makeup, so they seemed like they were being older. Even if they weren't really, they seemed really grown up because they wore makeup. So learning to see in this context involves attention and evaluation to specific parts of the body, and this kind of education of attention to what to look for. And this might be in terms of compliments, like, oh, I love your hair, you've got really nice eyes, or, bitching, or negative comments about people's bodies. And of course, these evaluation practices, they give a powerful incentive to self-scrutinize as well, because if you know that people are going to be talking about you, then what you've got to do is try and figure it out before they talk about you. So there's a lot of self-scrutinization as well, in order to preempt the scrutiny of others, although of course that's never possible. So if you know your body is going to be evaluated and critiqued in minute detail, no aspect of your body can be taken for granted. So this is Elizabeth talking about her body. So that there are parts of me that are my stomach can sometimes, it's not a fat stomach, but it can just get really bloated and stuff. I also have really fat fingers, so it's my hands and my toes that are the worst part of me, but that's understandable, look at them, laughing. And I feel like I have quite chubby cheeks, and my eyes are quite dull. So again, you can see this focus on tiny parts of the body that's going on. So it's not just about learning to see bodies in terms of a body ideal, but about learning to see bodies in terms of different parts, that you would really focus on all these tiny little parts of your body. And this, as is clear in school, is a really gendered and gendering processes, that girls are submitting each other and themselves to these kind of levels of scrutiny about their body and about the way they look in the way that boys aren't. So boys aren't submitting their peers to these same levels of scrutiny, at least in this respect. So we can see, of course, the presence of the body, the dominant body ideal in this. So it's not to deny the power of this slenderness ideal that circulates in our media and in social media, but to think about how it comes into girls' lives, and how it comes to shape their experiences to varying extents. What the peers around them are thinking about their bodies, and what you think that someone is thinking about your body, is really important. So again, to understand it just in individual terms doesn't make sense. We need to understand it in terms of the kinds of relationships that people are immersed in, the kinds of evaluations that goes on between people as well as within people. And of course, thinking about these things has also caused me to reflect on my own inskilled vision and my own way that I kind of evaluate my body and look at people and consider people attractive and consider people beautiful and divide up people's bodies in different ways. And kind of when I was thinking about my research, and I think it's important to put myself in there, that it's not just these girls who are doing it somehow differently from I'm doing it. But in fact, I've been in a very similar community of practice to these girls, and my vision has been inskilled in particular ways. And even after 15 years of reading social theory and reading feminist work and thinking about these things academically, I still do it. I still do it to myself, and I still do it when I'm looking at other people as well. So this kind of inskilled vision becomes very embedded, in our senses. It's quite hard to think yourself out of it. You can kind of think yourself out of it, but you're still in it. So to conclude, Christina Grassini writes, reconsidering the senses, even the most contaminated by the globalizing design of the West, means taking seriously an ecological and developmental account of ways of knowing. So body image is not internal or mental or straightforwardly cognitive. It's about training our attention in particular ways, in particular contexts, learning to see in particular ways. So what does this different perspective on why girls are unhappy with their bodies enable? Well, it enables us to say, okay, media is a part of life, and we can think about it, but we don't need to assume from the outset that that's the most important thing. We can think about all the other things that happen in people's lives, all the other things that people are engaged with, as well as in relation to media images. And of course, then we can see girls as skilled, active learners, so not just as kind of these passive, pathological consumers who are getting bad images poured into their heads, but people who are engaged in communities of practice, in social relationships, who are thinking about things and who are critical of things, as well as being part of things, as well as learning to see in particular ways. So I thought about this and I wrote about this, and then I thought about, okay, well, what are the implications for this? What are the implications for kind of practice? Well, one of the implications for this is, what do we do with educational interventions with girls? Because if we're doing educational interventions about body image which replicate this media cause and effect model, which is a theory of learning that is very much, as I said, the way that school happens. So we provide girls with information about body ideals. We provide them with information about, oh, you've got a bad diet of images, and don't you know that body ideals aren't really like this, and this is just an image of perfection you're being fed. Then what we're doing is just working from the same sets of assumptions, and we're not really thinking about how girls are embedded in everyday lives and what's going on for them. So if we want a way to think about making things better, then we also need to think about a more developmental, ecological way of learning and way of thinking about that. And taking these ideas, so moving away from these kind of conventional pedagogical approaches where we're kind of transmitting information about body ideals or about these negative images, I set up a project called Girlkind, which was co-founded with Sarah Ralph, who's a senior lecturer in media and culture at Northumbria University. And what was about saying, rather than saying assuming we know what the problems are, assuming we know what girls' experiences are, we just create the space for them to talk about what is going on in their lives. We position them as the experts in their own lives. And what comes out of this Girlkind project, so we start with a very open question, which is just, what is it like growing up as a girl in the Northeast today? And what comes out of this is sometimes about pressures on body, and sometimes about these kind of social media and stuff, but also absolutely loads of other stuff. And so it's about creating this space, which is quite hard to find in the school day because of the pressures that teachers are under for exam results and league tables and stuff like that. A supportive, safe space for girls to talk about the kinds of relationships they're engaged with, and maybe media images, but maybe not media images. And so we've been doing this in school, and we do these workshops, which is about that, and then how they want to represent it. So if they wanted adults to know what their experiences were like, what it's like growing up, how do they want to show it? And then we have a big celebration, which will be on the 12th of October this year, and you're all welcome to come, at Northumbria University. And it's about them showing their experiences of growing up as a girl, rather than us imposing our ideas about what the issues are, what the problems are, or why they feel a certain way. So I think I'll finish there, and we can pick up this discussion. So anything I haven't covered.